Hey guys, it's Will. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you are doing well. If you are new to the channel or if you're unsubscribed for any reason, but you do like the content, please do subscribe. It would be a great help. Thank you so much for that. Today we are here to talk about Revenge, the 1964 Japanese film, which was directed by Tadashi Imai, and it was written by Shinobu Hashimoto. And let me read you a couple other names here that I don't want to forget because they will be important to what I'm talking about in this video. Director of photography on this movie was Shunichiro Nakao. The art director was Takatoshi Suzuki, and set decoration by Kyoshi Kan. So what I want to talk about today is cinematic space, Japanese architecture, and the use of the naturally cinematic qualities of Japanese architecture in Revenge. So in order to talk about that, kind of like tentatively, I'm thinking of this video as cinematic space and Japanese architecture in Revenge, right? It's kind of what we're talking about here. I need to first explain to you what I mean by cinematic space, which is kind of a complicated thing to talk about because it's a multidimensional term, which we will discuss when we get into it. Then we need to talk about Japanese architecture, and then we can bring those things together and talk about the use of Japanese architecture and cinematic space in Revenge. When I say Japanese architecture, I really mean traditional Japanese architecture. So let me share my screen here and we'll jump right into our analysis. Cinematic space. This is a still from Children of Men, if you're unfamiliar. So when I say cinematic space, what am I talking about? It's a complicated term because ultimately it kind of has two meanings. Technically, cinematic space is whatever you're seeing when you watch a movie. It's the space within the frame of the camera. The philosophical question here, and this is all theory, by the way, there is no correct answer to this. This is just me talking about things that I like to geek out about because I'm such a huge fan of movies. The philosophical question we then have, if we define cinematic space as whatever space that we're looking at when we're watching a movie, what makes that space cinematic, or what are the inherently cinematic qualities of the space that we are looking at when we watch a film? And to me, a lot of that is about the three-dimensionality of the space, and a lot of that comes from depth, right? So when I think of cinematic storytelling, cinematic visuals, cinematic space, one of the first people who comes to mind for me and was one of my favorite filmmakers is Alfonso Cuarón. So this is from Children of Men. In the foreground here, we have Clive Owen. Okay, now this is a kind of a spoiler, but not really, because it's like the opening scene of this movie. Clive Owen goes to a coffee shop, comes out of the coffee shop. He's at this little thing here. I think it's like a newspaper thing. I can't remember what this is. And he's putting alcohol into his coffee on the street, and then he's going to go to work. Okay. And then the coffee shop blows up because someone has planted a bomb in the coffee shop. This shot to me is freaking incredible. And Alfonso Cuarón's decision to film this way for this scene, I think, is very, very cinematic when we talk about the use of space. They could have done a very flat shot here. You could have shown like the front of the coffee shop. Clive Owen comes out of it. There's an explosion. It's a very presentational, kind of theatrical, flat backdrop. Instead, he walks down the street and we see this deep, deep space going away from the camera with all of these layers of cars, people, buildings, trash bags on the street. We see the sidewalk. We see the street. We see the other side of the street. We're getting so much information about the world while we're getting a very deep space with lots of dynamic movement in it. And then the explosion comes out of this wall over here. You see the dust and the debris. So the explosion is coming sideways. So it's creating multiple planes of dynamic movement within the shot. So that to me is a very, very cinematic use of your cinematic space. So I have another still here from Children of Men. And I think they're 5 second long. Yeah, here we go. All right, so this is also Children of Men. And there's a lot about this shot that we can unpack in terms of cinematic use space, right? Because there's so much depth to this shot. We have this cage here, and then within this, there's multiple layers of people. We have a cage here, so we're creating layers of these cages and layers of people within them. Then we have this group of police officers here, right? And they are in this formation that creates depth here. Now, both the cops and these cages and the curvature of the building are kind of collapsing towards a vanishing point. So if you don't know what a vanishing point is, it's like kind of like the center point if you think about painting, right? If you're creating perspective to create depth within a painting, the vanishing point is the point kind of in the center towards which everything collapses, so that you create this really dynamic sense of space, depth, and perspective as you're coming out of that vanishing point, essentially. The vanishing point really would probably be like somewhere. So it's not exactly set up. That would make it look more artificial. It would make it look like a painting. Kubrick, and we will see a Kubrick still here in a second, is someone who used the vanishing point a lot as like a central focus of his composition. So they're very, very balanced. This is not perfectly balanced, but I think it's very deliberate, because I think Alfonso Cuarón wants you to feel like you're in a real world here and not like you're looking at a painting. But you have the building and you have this walkway here, which implies all of the space that you would have if you kept walking here. And there's just so many layers and so much depth to this shot. So again, it's really tremendous use of cinematic space. Something else that Alfonso Cuarón does, that he's talked about in interviews and stuff like that, is that he's very deliberate about the size of the people within the frame and the lenses that they use and the framing they use to create that effect, because he wants the people to be shown in their environment, because he wants the audience to think about the psychological and social effects that the environment has upon the people, which you can very much see. This is just a horrible thing to look at, of these humans in cages and these police officers, and like, it evokes a lot of, things that are happening in the world right now, but it also gives you this sense of the environment and the effect on sociology, psychology, and stuff like that, which all ties back into cinematic space. So let's move on to our next still here, and we will be talking about, ta-da, see, I told you, Stanley Kubrick. Now, I don't think this is the original aspect ratio. I'm not actually 100% sure what the aspect ratio of this film is. I just grabbed this still off of Google Images. This might be a set photo and not like an actual screenshot from the film, but vanishing point, right? I mean, everything in this this image is collapsing towards a center point right here, right? Which is the vanishing point. So this is a much more balanced composition than the Alfonso Cuarón compositions we were looking at. And but depth, right? There's so much depth here because it's a tunnel, right? So that it's very, very cinematic, because we're seeing this kind of collapsing, kaleidoscoping space with a lot of depth in it. And if a character is walking away from us or walking towards us, or if the camera is moving, or if both of those things are happening, you create a lot of dynamic movement, which gives you a lot of depth, which creates a very cinematic experience. You think about a play, right? To talk about a medium that is narrative and character driven, in which there are performance aspects and stuff like that. Plays are on stage, and even if it's a stage that's in the round, you have a limited, essentially relatively flat space. So how do you differentiate cinema from that? And I think part of that is depth. Depth and movement differentiate, even though we're looking at stills here, cinema from photography, because you can have shots that move and things that move within those shots. So how do you maximize that dynamic? It's something else that you can think about if you're thinking about cinematic space. So moving on from Kubrick, we come to John Woo. Okay, so I have another channel for Hong Kong cinema, so I'm a huge fan of Hong Kong cinema. John Woo is a very, very dynamic and cinematic filmmaker. I think this shot from this shootout in Hard Boiled is so good, because you have, if you want to talk about cinematic space, you have foreground, you have middle ground, you have background. And within these fields, you have all these dynamic compositions. So you have Chow Yun-fat here with the gun pointing at this guy he shot. Now look at this broken piece of furniture over here. It's also pointing in this direction. So you're essentially creating a triangle here of characters who are in conflict, and then this piece of furniture here, creating kind of like a frame within a frame. You also have these things on the walls here, you see, or these pillars or whatever they are, creating essentially like a little stage in this area. And then you have this other kind of section of the room back here where you have all this smoke happening, right? And you've got this window and all these objects back here. So this is a very, very busy image that creates an enormous amount of depth. There's also a dynamic there's the movement of the Chow Yun-fat character standing up, shooting this guy, the movement of this guy getting shot and falling down, movement of camera. There's a lot of movement in this shot too that makes it very, very dynamic. But just this image, there's so much depth to it. And there's so much to look at, and there's so many planes, and I just think it's a really fantastic and dynamic and cinematic shot. And then we have one more shot from Hard Boiled here, which is I mean, this is a very, very famous section of this film where the Chow Yun-fat character slides down this railing while he's shooting these guys with two guns in his hand. And you've probably seen still images from this scene before if you know anything about Hong Kong cinema or John Woo or anything like that. But look at how fantastic the composition is here, right? First of all, depth, depth, depth. I cannot overemphasize depth because it gives you three-dimensional space. It gives you movement. It gives you space to move into, both character and camera. It's very cinematic, right? This is the end of the building. So this is the street basically out here. So you have this implied space of the whole outside world, right? You have the guns and the railing pointing your vision at the people he's shooting. So you have a dynamic relationship between, I would call this the foreground, I would call this the midground here, and the action that is taking place on both of these planes. Then you have all these people in the middle here who are ducking down to get away from the shots. So we have movement in there up and down. We have movement of Chow Yun-fat going this way, movement of those guys running away from him. It's just a very, very dynamic, incredibly cinematic way to shoot this. So this is just stuff that I think about where I'm like, why did the director, the cinematographer, the camera, come on, this is Lawrence of Arabia. This is ridiculous. Why did they put the camera where they put it, and how does it enhance qualities that are unique to cinema that you couldn't get from another medium? Now, of course, if you're doing a play, or if you're not going to get these giant freaking mountains and the desert like Lawrence of Arabia. And if this is when I just saw this movie for the first time in 70 millimeter on the big screen, and it's just like pure cinema. It's so huge, it like boggles the mind. The scale of this film is just preposterous, and the cinematography is 70. I think they shot it in 70, and it's Panavision, I think, and it's just like obscenely gorgeous. Look at how much visual information is in here. So again, you have foreground, midground, background, right? Your foreground is these people sitting here. The midground is like 1,000 people on horses, which is, again, dynamic movement, right? And it's not movement in a straight presentational line like you would get in a play. They're kind of coming at a diagonal down here, right? So you're getting lots of dynamic movement. The sand is being kicked up by the horses as they're running, and there's literally like hundreds, if not thousands of people there on those horses. And then you have these insane mountains in the background. And you don't just get mountains, you get layers within layers, because you see that there's like this little, whatever, crevice or cave here. There's another one here. There's another one over here. And you have the layers of the cliffs here, these ones in the front, and then these ones over here. And if you look all the way back, you've got this other one. There's just so much visual information here. It's so huge. We have this really strong delineation of colors between the blue up here and the kind of tan, whatever color of the sand this is, these reddish kind of brown mountains. You've got these people wearing black and red over here. It's just a stunning shot. And Lawrence of Arabia is just like a masterpiece of the use of cinematic space. Okay, so Lawrence of Arabia. Now, where are we going next? Kurosawa. What's interesting about Kurosawa is that now I'm not like a cinematographer, so if I'm wrong about this, let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Kurosawa used telephoto lenses, which are like really long lenses, and he would shoot from far away, and it would give the effect of compressing space, right? So Tatsuya Nakadai plays this guy right here. If you look at the distance between Tatsuya Nakadai and these rows of soldiers here, it looks like they're like literally on top of each other, basically. But if you look right here, between the bottom of the stairs and this phalanx of dudes with the red flags here, that's a fair amount of distance, right? And this castle and this staircase is not completely flat, but it looks completely flat, right? So it's the way that Kurosawa is shooting this is flattening the space. And yet still, you have all these layers. You have the dynamic movement of the Tatsuya. If you haven't seen this film, the castle is burning, which in and of itself is very cinematic because you have the movement of the flames and the smoke, right? The Tatsuya Nakadai character walks down the stairs. So he's moving towards us. So it's creating movement and the dynamic movement of him going from a place I would call that the midground towards the foreground. And then you have the background of this fence here. But this does create like a relatively flat effect, which is interesting. But I think the flatness of it enhances the dynamic qualities of the fire and of the Tatsuya Nakadai character walking down these stairs. And these guys are kind of like swaying and shimmying in the film. So there's movement there too. And there's a lot of dynamic movement in this shot. So from there, we go to 7. So, and I guess I should have apologized up front that there is a tiny spoiler for 7 in this video. This is a David Fincher movie, obviously. What struck me is, I mean, David Fincher is a very, 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 very cinematic director. He's an incredible filmmaker. Obviously, everyone knows that. He's like one of the greatest of his generation, maybe one of the greatest ever, but he's an incredible director. What struck me as really interesting about this shot is that this shot is essentially functional, right? So if you've seen 7, then you'll know that in this scene, the Kevin Spacey character, John Doe, is turning himself in and admitting that he is this serial killer who they've been looking for. So it's a functional shot of him saying, I'm your guy, look at me, I'm covered in blood, arrest me. They could have set this scene anywhere. And this shot has a lot of depth and dynamics to it because you have the Kevin Spacey character right here in the middle. Then you've got this corner here, right? So it's creating this sense of like this space collapsing kind of above his shoulder. And you've got a lamppost here. And then you've got a bunch of people back here. And you've got this woman standing here. And then there's also someone behind Kevin Spacey. So you can kind of see their head coming up over his shoulders. And then you've got this kind of balcony thing that's going on up here. It's a very architecturally busy space. It makes it cinematic by giving depth and texture. And there's a lot of lines in here, right? You have this thing, this is kind of like an overhang sticking out here. You've got the lines that are built within the architecture that are designed on the wall. You've got this column here. You've got this column here. You've got this line cutting across this wall here. You've got the line of this thing in the corner. You've got these lines down here. You've got these lines on the desk. There's a lot of lines and there's a lot of dynamics and there's a lot of visual information happening here. So it's not just this boring static shot of like him standing against a blank wall. You have depth and dynamics within the space. But it's, again, it's a functional shot, right? So it doesn't need to be complicated like that. So this is Maltese Falcon. And this is not the aspect ratio of this film. I found this online, and Maltese Falcon, I think, was shot in Academy ratio, which I think is 1.37 to 1, so it would be more square than this. But what's interesting about this shot to me is it's basically just two guys sitting in chairs and they're talking to each other. And you could have shot this against a wall, or they could have been sitting on the same bench right next to each other, right? Just like talking. And instead, they've arranged these chairs around this column here, right? And then you have all of this stuff happening in the background. They're in the lobby of a hotel, if I remember correctly. It's been a couple of years since I watched this. This is an incredible movie, and you should go watch it if you've never seen it before. Or you should rewatch it if it's been a while since you've seen it. But this is a scene that could have taken place literally anywhere. And by setting it in this hotel lobby and by keeping the hotel lobby in the background, you get lots of movement and you get lots of depth. And so it gives you a sense of being in a space that is a three-dimensional lived-in space, not just like a flat presentational area. And that's what struck me as really, really unique and interesting and cinematic about this shot. And then we go to, did I pause it? Here we go. Written on the Wind by Douglas Sirk. So this film came out, I think, 1955. And okay, so this is an office. An office is one of the most boring places in the world that you can set a scene, right? So how do you make an office dynamic and visually interesting and give it cinematic qualities? Depth. First of all, you've got the glass doors. So right away, that opens the space up, because look at this wall. This is just this horrible industrial like gray color, right? If this wall here had been horrible industrial gray color, this would be probably a pretty boring, ugly kind of pedestrian shot without a really great sense of space. But they knock the wall out here and they put these glass doors. And then you have a patio, which is, I think, a very smart production design decision, because it gives you more dynamic space your characters can potentially move into. It's not just a flat background. And then you have I'm assuming this is a painted background of the city here, but it's not flat. You see, the shot is taken at an angle. So there's these implied angles within the painting in the background that gives you this sense of dynamic space that's not just flat static space. And you have diagonal lines like this right here, right? And the line on the chair here, and the wall is at a diagonal, which means this thing pushed up against the wall is at a diagonal. This wall back here is at a diagonal. Everything is diagonally pushing us to view this long, deep space, which makes what might be an ordinarily boring scene very visually dynamic and interesting. Now, I think here we're going to start getting into movement, because movement is also incredibly cinematic. So what we're going to look at here is the combination of movement of character, movement of camera, and depth of space. This shot is from Written on the Wind, the same movie that the still before was from. Like I said, 1955, I believe this was directed by Douglas Sirk. The camera is going to push towards the character. The character is going to run towards the camera. That's going to enhance the effect of the depth because you're getting dynamic movement in two directions. Character's going to turn, camera's going to turn. So here we're pushing in as she's running towards us, then the camera pans as she's running over there, right? So it gives you three-dimensional space in multiple directions because we're seeing the depth back to the staircase, and then we turn and we're seeing this wall over here. So we're seeing a space with more visual information in a closer proximity to what would be your space if you were in it and you could walk around 360 degrees, right? You're getting a more dynamic sense of the space. So it's what makes space cinematic to me is not just, as we were looking at previously, we were looking at stills and just how setting up a shot in a certain way and looking from certain angles creates depth and cinematic qualities. Here we're looking at movement of camera, movement of character, and those two things together within space. Now, if I'm not mistaken, our next clip here is going to be from Fellini. I am a huge Fellini fan, so I could geek out about this for a very long time. This shot is from 8.5, and this shot is freaking incredible. So we're going to break it down here. Marcello Mastroianni here is sitting in what I guess is the foreground, and there's this fence here. Right away, this is a cinematic shot to me because look at all this depth. And you've got this huge, whatever this thing is, gate fence here, creating all these dynamic lines within the space. So it's visually interesting. It partitions foreground and background. And so in a way, it's a little bit theatrical because it's like it's creating a stage here, but we see the three-dimensional space behind it. Now, this is where this gets really awesome because we're going to get movement intersecting in multiple directions. So Guido is the name of his character in the movie. So Guido is just hanging out and he stands up and he walks, and the camera's going to move with him laterally, right? So we're seeing all this depth of space behind him, but we're moving side to side. And here comes the train. The train is moving from the background to the foreground towards us as we are moving side to side. So it's intersecting planes of movement, and you have Guido moving and looking at the train, and you've got this guy moving in the background. Okay, now the train comes in. And this is just, I mean, massive objects moving towards the camera when the camera is like kind of from your POV is always just really, really cool and exciting. Okay, now we get this shot from Guido's point of view. Okay, there's some really awesome dynamic cinematic stuff that happens here. It looks like just a shot of these people getting off the train, and he just puts his glasses on, he's just kind of looking at them, and then, wait for it, boom. The hand of whoever this guy is, signal conductor, train operator, whatever, comes up with this sign. And suddenly you're creating multiple planes of depth within this shot. That's such a good detail because they could have very easily done this shot without that thing popping up. It's still an interesting and dynamic and cinematic shot, but now you're getting movement of this thing going up within the frame, right? As people are moving towards it, emphasizing their distance from the camera and their movement towards us. It's just so dynamic and cinematic. Okay, so that's a pretty good discussion, I hope, of what I'm talking about when I talk about cinematic space. So now what we're going to talk about is traditional Japanese architecture. And when I talk about that, what I'm really talking about is interiors, the relationship between interior and exterior, and sliding screens, which are called shoji in Japanese architecture. Look at this room. And this is really, I think, like we're seeing, I think, 4 rooms here, because there's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. And there's the outside space out there. And then I don't know if this is like a room or a closet or whatever, but there's something over here, right? The shoji are these screens here, okay? Now, wherever you see these things on the floor here, that's where you can slide screens across, right? So here we get this really dynamic, very deep space that's deep going back kind of side to side and deep front to back, right? That you can get all kinds of dynamic movement within. And you have these screens, so you can slide screens. We're going to see a lot of this in Revenge, the way they use the screens to create an enormous amount of depth and really just really visually engaging compositions, right? It allows you to create really complex spaces with complex light, with tons of lines, and with enormous layers of depth. Other thing that's worth pointing out is that Japanese architecture is relatively low. It's not super vertical. And again, traditional Japanese architecture, it's not super vertical the way that Western architecture is. It's more long and low, like wide screen cinema ratios. So it just lends itself to the frame of cinema. I think we got a couple more Japanese architecture stills here, just so I can, yeah, see, and again, here, so inside and outside space too. This is something we're going to talk about in Revenge. Japanese architecture, you can slide these screens open in different ways to create different relationships between interior and exterior, where like the partitions between them kind of start to dissolve. It's really, really, really cool. Now, oh, and I just wanted to go back to this too, because this is a screenshot from Written on the Wind. Look at how incomplete the architecture here is. This is what I'm talking about. This is a widescreen composition, but we're in a space that's very tall. So we don't see really what's on the second floor. We can barely see the top of the staircase. We don't really know where this wall is going. The top of the door is cut off. We know that there's a ton of space over here we can't see. Whereas in that Japanese, in the photos of the Japanese architecture, you're seeing complete pieces of architecture in the widescreen format. Whereas we can see here, the widescreen format is not really copacetic with the vertical nature of Western architecture. Okay, so this is a screenshot from Revenge. So we're going to start to get into what I'm really talking about here. This is a very kind of functional scene of two people talking. But look at how visually dynamic it is. This could just be two people sitting on a bench, two people sitting at a table. And instead, when I was talking about inside and outside, you've got this screen open. You've got the bushes out here. You've got the fog coming by. You've got a line coming this way with this screen, right? So you're basically creating a space within a space, a frame within a frame, right? Because you've got this thing over here. So you've got this frame within the larger frame of the shot itself. This guy is framed against the outside. This guy is kind of framed over here. You've got this higher little thing. This is like a little platform here. You've got the windowsill here. And look at all of these lines everywhere. The other thing I love about this is, we're obviously not seeing the ceiling in this shot, but the architecture feels complete. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but why I think that is, look at all of these lines, right? And now look at the line at the top of the frame. It feels like another one of these lines, these horizontal lines. So it implies completion of patterns. And it doesn't feel like we're really missing a ton of visual information. And this is just a shot of like two dudes just sitting here talking. But it's so dynamic and deep and interesting. It has so many spaces within it. Again, it's just a dude sitting here talking. If he were in like a Western style building and there was just a flat wall behind him, boring. You got the Japanese screens, they have paintings on them. So right away, you're getting additional visual information. You have the tatami mats on the floor with all of these lines. You've got this line of the shadow here, right? Because there's visual information in this shadow. We can see the closets and stuff. We've got a column here. We've got a column here. We've got all of these vertical lines here. There's so much depth behind him and so many spaces and so many lines, so much visual information that the architecture is creating an inherently cinematic space in literally just a shot of this guy sitting here talking. Now, indoor and outdoor again. I mean, this shot is freaking incredible, right? Because he's sitting at the edge of the room. The doors are open. See how the line on the screen here basically intersects with the top of the frame. Again, we're not seeing the ceiling in here, but there's the implication of the completion of the pattern of the architecture. So it feels like a whole space. It doesn't, my eye isn't being like, what's over there? I feel like this is the whole thing. Frame within a frame, right? So you get the frame of what the camera's seeing, and then you get the frame in here. So we know what we're looking at. You've got this thing at a diagonal here. You've got this mini stone pagoda looking thing. You've got all of these plants. I think this is a pond, the rocks, the trees, like so much depth and so much information. It's such a whole and complete world. You feel like you're really there. Again, completion. I know I'm talking about this a lot. Look, we see the roof, right? So it's a complete piece. We get the whole thing. The way that he's framed within the doorway here, and he's walking in this shot. As he walks by each one of these spaces, he gets framed within each one of them. So it gives you constantly changing, interesting, dynamic, cinematic visual information through the simple act of him walking through this space. So this is a shot. We're going to get into some shots here now. Already we've got a ton of depth, and we see this wall here. So we know we've got depth in multiple directions, right? Which is, to me, that's an essential component of cinematic space, because you want to feel like you're in a three-dimensional world that you could actually exist in yourself, that you could go in and walk around in, right? So we've got all this depth here, but we've got the implication of depth here, and then the camera's going to start turning. Look at that. It's so dynamic. And again, it's just a shot of this dude sitting here, but there's so much dynamic depth and movement. And so much of that, I think, is due to the natural qualities of the architecture. The fact that you can slide that screen open and the outside becomes part of the inside space in a way, or does the inside space become part of the outside space? Then you've got these books and stuff here. The tatami mats, I think those are the mats that are on the floor. They have lines, so they create depth and a sense of movement towards something. You've got the partially open screen here, which leads to this space, and there's a space over here, which I am guessing that would probably be a hallway. Maybe there's another room over here. There's this room in the background here. There's the painting on the screens. There's so many layers, and they're all there because of the natural qualities of the Japanese architecture that just makes it so. And again, completion. Look, lines, hard line at the top of the screen. It gives you a sense of completeness. So these guys are just chatting. And again, it's just a scene of these dudes sitting here talking, but there's like, they don't even need to cut back and forth between the two dudes' faces, because there's such a dynamic relationship. This is, I would call this the foreground, this is the midground, and this is the background. And it's so dynamic and cinematic that we're not doing this generic thing of like, here's our wide shot, and then here's our medium close-ups, and this just cut back and forth. This is just awesome. So this is a still. This is not a shot where there's movement in it, but taking us outside, right? You can see how this is low for a wall, right? It's low and it's long and wide, like a widescreen composition. But then you've got this thing coming back, and you've got this thing coming back, and it's like these diagonal lines, like I talked about with the Alfonso Cuarón shot, or like with Kubrick, the idea of a vanishing point. It's leading you into this very dynamic, very deep space with tons and tons of characters and really interesting visual information everywhere, all because of where you're putting the camera and how you're utilizing the natural qualities of the architecture. But again, depth, right? They're not shooting from the side. You get so much more information, so many more people in the frame, the dynamics of the trees, this kind of thing, whatever this is back here, right? The roof of this building back here, the shape of the roof here, like there's so much more information here than you could get if you just, let's say you shot, what ends up happening in the scene is these two guys kind of walk down here and then they talk to these guys over here. If you shot a flat shot of these guys against the wall walking and a flat shot of these guys over here, and then you cut between them talking, that would be visually boring. This is not. It's incredibly dynamic. Okay, now, right away, again, this is just guys sitting here talking. They're at a table, right? So if you were in a standard kind of Western room, you wouldn't have the added depth of having the screen slid to the side and this guy in the background here. Now, you could say, well, if they were in a restaurant, you could have other people at other tables. That is absolutely true, and you would not be wrong about that. But look at this space over here. I don't even know what's over here, but this is like a hallway of some kind, I think, and it extends out behind these guys. You've got this line here. You've got all these lines here. You've got the vertical lines in addition to the horizontal lines. Like there's so much depth and information creating this sense of everything kind of collapsing around these guys, and it's all just due to the natural qualities of the architecture. Now, here's where this gets really, really dynamic and fascinating to me. These guys are talking about an other person. And we get that character coming up here in just a second. I don't have the subtitles turned on because this is really just about, but look at the guy in the background is moving, right? So if you're getting bored watching these guys, you can see this guy in the background is like doing some kind of scholarly work, right? And boom, we pan to this dude. Now, because of this is a Japanese space and you open these sliding screens and you'll have intersecting rooms and hallways, and this is outside. So we're getting the light from the outside, the shadows from the light, and again, the implication of additional space, because we know this opens up to like a courtyard, right? But it's such a dynamic movement from those guys to this guy, and it creates such a sense of depth, right? Now we cut in, see, like I said, this guy's standing to the outside. Look at all these, you get the trees over here, so much dynamic information in the background there, and all these lines creating these kind of geometric qualities. And here, like, this is a relatively flat shot, right, of these guys and that guy, and you can't really discern how much distance there is between them. If it were just these walls, it might not be that interesting, but because this screen is open, we've got the roof up here, we've got the tree over here, we've got this kind of other roof over here, there's like this kind of stonework at the bottom of this wall. You're just getting so much information. And this is kind of like the end of the, well, this is interesting though, because he, like I said, we couldn't tell how far away he was from these guys, but then he walks into a fair amount of space. So this is obviously kind of a compressed shot because they look like they're right on top of each other, but he's able to move a pretty fair distance away from them. So again, this is a very deep composition because you've got them in the foreground, him in the background, and then he moves towards them again. Then we cut to them, and you got that guy working away still in the back, which is hilarious because like they're talking shit on him, and then he comes in and starts talking shit on them, and the guy in the background is just like, this is not my problem. I'm just gonna sit back here and do my scholarly work. But this is a super dynamic shot too, because look, you get the trees, you get the open screens, you get so much space back there. It's not just a corner of a wall. Okay, this shot is, there's a couple shots here, but this scene is freaking ridiculous. So this guy is walking out of this space here. So we've got depth in this direction. We've got depth going this way into the corner. We've got the woman sitting here. We've got, who even knows how many layers of depth we have going on back here? Because I think this is outside. So this is like an other courtyard on the other side of this part of the building. You've got a room here, all of these guys. How many people are in this frame? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 10 people in this frame, and you still have all of these dynamic open spaces, despite how many people you have in a relatively tight frame. So you get the movement of him coming out and of the guy walking towards him, and he hands him his spear here, and he's talking to the dudes. And then we push in, and it enhances. Oh, so that's an altar. I thought that was outside. See, this is an altar here. Look how much depth there is here and how much we can see. And the depth back here. Look, there's even a screen they took off of one of the little partition things, and they just set it, they leaned it against the wall over here, right? And you've got whatever this is, like a bed or like maybe like some samurai robes that someone left on the floor, and there's like some kind of receptacle here, right? And you've got all this depth over here. Dynamic movement too, because the guy's walking away from the camera and the camera is following him. So it creates a sense of being, what am I doing here? Of very dynamic movement into the space. So it feels like a real deep 3-dimensional space. It's so deep, daddy. So this guy's talking to the homies. And then he walks back over here, again, enhancing the depth of the space because we frame him. He's framed in this doorway here. And we turn around and look at all this. I think this is probably a set, right? I don't know for sure, but this guy's holding his spear here, and we've got this wall, and we've got all these trees, and there's just so much depth to the shot. And you've got this guy, foreground, midground, background. So you've got your 3 planes here. It's just, I mean, like, this is just such, like, this is just run-of-the-mill business. These guys are talking about functional plot stuff, but it's just visually so dynamic, right? And here you've got this wall of dudes, which is very horizontal, right? But then you've got the depth of the space through, you've got your foreground here, your midground, and your background of all this stuff here. And you've got this tree and these lines of all these plants back here. So it's giving you a lot of depth, but you can also have this kind of presentational formation of these dudes sitting there listening to him talk. The visual design in this movie just blew me away. And we come to the end of our video. So my name is Will, and you've been watching me talk about the naturally cinematic qualities of Japanese architecture as on display in Tadashi Imai's 1964 film Revenge. And I don't want to give possessory credit of the film to Tadashi Imai. It was written by Shinobu Hashimoto. The DP was Shunichiro Nakao, art director Takatoshi Suzuki, and the set direction was Kiyoshi Kan. Let me know what you think about this video. I had a lot of fun doing this. I really enjoyed this kind of format of videos. So if you like this kind of stuff, I would be down to talk about any movie that anyone is interested in hearing me talk about in any kind of way. So give me video ideas in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.